Howdy, y'all. Welcome to this edition of the History of Christianity Season 2. We're on part 33 today, and the title of this one is An Age Beyond Christendom. So this is going to begin the last section of the material we're looking at for our structure in this study. And we got about 12 to 14 more weeks to go, counting this one. And so today is going to kind of introduce the last part of this study on the history of Christianity. And the way this is structured, we're going to be looking at very broad, general things about this period of time that's going to go from the 18th century to the present day. So we're going to look at today a very, very broad brushstroke, look at that time period, some things that we need to be aware of and understand. This is going to be very history heavy today. And that's going to be Western European, North and South American, but even world history things to kind of look at as a setup for what the church is going to be facing and dealing with during this period of time. So we know that there's a lot of very significant events you'll most likely be very familiar with. And in order to really understand the history of the church, you have to understand the history of the time in which the church is existing, because it's going to be in some ways a product of that time. And that's certainly true here. So we start by looking at economic and political upheaval during this time. Political changes in Europe and the Western Hemisphere marked the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th centuries. So there's certainly going to be a lot of things going on. During the second half of the 18th century, the economic power of a new class had increased. In France, this new class was the bourgeois. We know that that's not a new term. We've been talking about them for a little while, but they're going to start to really get a lot more power during this period of time. In the Western Hemisphere, riches were based on agriculture and the trade derived from it, and therefore the colonials who owned the land had become the new aristocracy of money. So it's going to be a new group that's going to rise to the top, even throughout the rest of the Western Hemisphere. And also in France, this group is going to really take a more prominent role in leadership and kind of dictating what's going to be coming than they have in the past. The interest of this new aristocracy and of the European bourgeois conflicted with the older aristocracy of blood. So we're going to see a big shift from one group to the next during this time. In France, the lower classes were allied with the bourgeois against the old aristocracy, whom they viewed as parasites living off the products of their labor. So this is the old ruling class. And in France, there's a new ruling class coming, or at least a group that's going to rise to the top, the bourgeois. But the lower class really actually allied with them because they wanted to get rid of this old group. And we know what is going to be coming there with the French Revolution. In the New World, the lower classes were allied with the new economic aristocracy against the old aristocracy, whom they saw as foreigners profiting from the colonials without understanding their dreams and problems. So we certainly understand that from U.S. history, the formation of the United States of America. A lot of that had to do with a group of people that had left and were now in the New World and had to deal with the challenges and also the benefits they could reap from the hard work that they were doing against a group of people that just kind of wanted to sit back and rake in the profits. And that wasn't happening ultimately. So we see this throughout the world. We see this throughout Western civilization, that there's a big shift coming, and it's going to kind of move one group out, but then that vacuum is going to be filled by another one. All of this resulted in the independence of the United States, the French Revolution, and the independence of most of Latin America. So, of course, those revolutionary movements are going to be big factors as we go through this last section on the history of Christianity. These revolutions marked the beginning of a new period in history and were followed by other revolutions throughout the 19th century and well into the 20th. So we see kind of a worldwide phenomenon that it's going to be out with the old, in with the new kind of deal. And it's not going to just be in one place. It's going to happen in several places. These revolutions show that the 19th and 20th centuries were a time of great political and social upheavals that would have a serious impact on Christianity as a whole. So as we go through this last section, we'll see what that impact is. There's also expansion to look at as well. The 19th century was marked by a geographic expansion of Christianity comparable only to that of the 16th. In the 16th century, that was Catholicism. If you'll remember, we actually discussed that on the first season. Towards the end of that study, we saw a big expansion of Catholicism into the New World, particularly in South America. And it was a missionary movement to the New World by the Catholics. Now there's going to be a new one of these, and it's going to be the Protestants this time, though. The 19th century saw Protestantism expand similarly to the great expansion of Catholicism in the 16th century. So that same movement we're going to see that we saw with Catholicism, we're going to see it now with the Protestant church. At the opening of the 19th century, it seemed as if European colonialism had passed its zenith. That expansion that took place that brought the European countries into the North American and South American continents. And it seemed like that time was kind of coming to an end. We're going to see it didn't, of course. The independence of the United States left Britain with only Canada and several islands in the Caribbean as American colonies. And obviously, as the United States expands west, it's going to sweep out everybody. And there won't be any more colonies there. It's just going to be a new nation. And so those groups are going to have to find other places to go. The French lost Haiti, and Spain lost all its American lands except Cuba and Puerto Rico. So out they're going to go, and this area is going to become a new place. And it's not going to be the colony. It's not going to be the colonial effort anymore. But the Napoleonic Wars turned Britain's attention toward the colonies held by its enemies. So one thing that happened with the Napoleonic Wars is what should have or was thought would lead to an end of colonialism actually pushed it out more, because what's going to happen is Britain fights in the Napoleonic Wars. They had a great naval force. And so that naval force is going to obviously not going to be land-based. It's going to be able to get around. And in order to attack the enemy, they're going to be able to center on some of these colonies held by their enemies. And so they're going to end up expanding without even really intending to. When the wars ended, Britain's naval superiority left it with several former French and Dutch colonies. So they're going to get a continuation of the colonial effort in a way that was not really in their plans, but certainly one that they took advantage of. As colonialism swept around the world, Christianity came with it. And that's what we see throughout this period of time as Western civilization, Western culture, Western thinking people move throughout the world, whether you want to look at that as being a good thing or a bad thing. Obviously, in the time in which we live, there's been reevaluation of the things that probably in the past were celebrated and now, at least for some, are not celebrated any longer. But regardless of that, and this is not a political deal, so we're not going to get into all that, but regardless of that, their side effect of it was that Christianity went with these groups as they expanded their culture, as they expanded their nations to other parts of the world. They certainly were going to bring Christianity with them. And whether they intended to or not, throughout all of this, there's going to be a big missionary movement. And Christianity is going to be carried throughout the world in a way that it never had in its history. And there's going to be some long-lasting effects of that. Of course, if you know anything about this time period, you're going to realize that a huge factor through anything that's going to happen at this time is the Industrial Revolution. That's certainly going to be the case with the church and the culture. These events coincided with the main reasons for colonial expansion in the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution. So the needs that came about as a result of the Industrial Revolution, things that were necessary for that effort to continue to take hold, that's going to be one of the main reasons for colonial expansion, and we'll see why in just a moment. As technological advances were applied to industrial production, greater capital and wider markets became necessary. And as you look at the Industrial Revolution, it makes sense that you're going to need a couple of things. One, if you're going to be able to take advantage of the Industrial Revolution to produce things in numbers that you never have been able to do before, you're going to need some money to do that. You're going to need capital. You're going to need capital to build the factories. You're going to need capital to pay the workers. You're going to need capital to buy the raw materials that you're going to need for production. And then obviously you're not producing things just for fun to do it. You want to make money off of it. So you're going to need the capital to get it started, but then you're going to need markets to sell. And as a result of that, the Industrial Revolution is going to really expand throughout the entire world, even those places that don't necessarily actually benefit from it in the sense that they didn't get the Industrial Revolution there. They didn't get all the new technology, but they maybe became one of the markets to sell the goods. So it's going to certainly affect the entire world. For a while, those areas of Europe that had not been industrialized provided the markets, but soon the industrial powers found new outlets in Latin America and Asia. And you need a lot of markets. It's not going to just be a few. You're going to keep producing. So for a while, there were parts of Europe that didn't take advantage, or they were not able to be in on the Industrial Revolution. So they're prime market. They're not making any of this stuff for themselves. They're going to need it. But that eventually you can only sell to them so much, and then you have to move on. So the Western European powers found that there are going to be markets in Latin America and Asia, and that's going to cause them to expand to these areas that they hadn't really been to in the same way, although certainly there had been an expansion into the New World. But even the Asian market's going to be a whole new world for them, as they're going to look at them as being a prime place to go to sell their goods that they're manufacturing. Over time, the need shifted from new markets to raw materials for industry. So eventually you get the new markets, they become the steady markets. You've got what you need to be able to sell. But then now that you've got all these new markets and you're trying to sell as much as you can and you're producing a lot, well, you're going to have raw materials to do that. So that became the next emphasis for expansion as a result of the Industrial Revolution. By 1870, control of the resources of the former Spanish colonies in South America became the prize for Britain, France, and the United States. So there's a shift that South America, although you still certainly are going to sell stuff to them, that wasn't the emphasis any longer. They're a great source for the raw materials. There's a lot of very rich land that you can harvest trees and dig out whatever it is that you need for raw materials. And so that it became a big push to go into those areas and be able to establish yourself so that you could take advantage of getting those materials you're going to need to continue the benefits of having had the Industrial Revolution. In Asia, the European Industrial Revolution had similar consequences. In these areas, colonialism took its more traditional form of military conquest and political domination. So the European countries come in and they find Asia as a place that's ripe for them to take over areas so that they can then use those areas to produce what they want. They're going to certainly use them as markets, but to be able to go out and take, again, the resources they need. So the colonial movement now is going to go away from North America, and it's now going to center on South America and in Asia. But by the middle of the 20th century and into the 21st, there would be a reaction against all of this, obviously. After war in the Pacific and revolution in China, nations such as Japan, China, India, and Korea emerged as political and economic powers. So there'll be a shift from these areas being independent, of having their own governments, to Western countries coming in and colonizing them. And then eventually the colony movement will be pushed out and they're going to reassert themselves in their own countries. So we see that whole process happen throughout this 18th, 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries. The search for sources of raw materials drove the colonization of Black Africa. Many in Europe became convinced that in order to be a power of the first order, a nation had to rule an overseas empire. So it became a prestige thing, but it was also a necessary thing. So you've moved into South America, you're getting what you're going to get out of that. You're moved into Asia, or in the process of moving into Asia, you're going to get what you're going to get out of that. Is it ever enough? No, it's never enough. So the next spot, well, wait a minute, what about Africa? There's a lot down there that's nobody has control of, and it would be fairly easy to go in and take control. And that's exactly what happened. So now you're looking at colonies in South America, in Asia, and now into Africa. And it's all because of the needs associated with the Industrial Revolution. During the 20th and 21st centuries, nationalistic reactions to these conquered territories led to a series of independent nations. So eventually, the party's going to end for these groups, and they're gonna come in and retake their own territory, and that's going to have a long-lasting effect as well. Another thing that we see as a result of industrialization and technology coming to the forefront in Western culture is a new type of military might. The colonial expansion of the 19th century was made possible thanks to another consequence of modern industrial development, military might. So the way wars had always been fought is going to go away, and it's going to be a whole new way of doing things, and it's going to shift a lot of power to the first few nations that become industrialized enough and technologically advanced enough to be able to wage war in this new way. And there's going to be some big time effects of that. Western powers had weapons with which they could defeat even vastly larger armies. When you've got an army that is a traditional army that's used to fighting on horseback, that's used to fighting with swords and shields, spears, arrows, and bows, whatever it is, and you've got cannons and guns and armored vehicles, that's no contest. It doesn't matter if you got the superior numbers. In the past, when armies fought, it would largely be wars of attrition. You would kind of bang everybody into each other, run or even stand in a line and shoot arrows at one another, sword fight, however it may have happened. And you just went through, and then whoever kind of the last man standing or the group that had the most people left, that was the winner. The rest would try to retreat or get out. Now it's a different world. It doesn't matter if you've got the most numbers. You could have way less numbers. And if you've got the ability to wage war in this new way, you can fight armies much bigger than yourself that you would have never in the past. You probably wouldn't even gone up against them unless you absolutely had to. And that's going to be a big power shift. Even such nations as China and Japan had to surrender to what would have otherwise been second-rate powers. So a big change in the world. Only a handful of nations in Asia and Africa were able to retain their political independence, and even those were forced to give up their economic independence. So again, these nations are going to be taken over, and the colonizing of them is going to occur, and eventually there's going to be a pushback, and the pushback is going to result in these powers that took over are going to be out, and all of these nations will regain their power eventually, but not before there's going to be a big effect of having had those countries or those nations involved with them for a long period of time. China and Japan were forced to open trade with the West. For the first time in history, the world became a vast economic network. So it wasn't just a deal where, hey, we'd like to come trade with you. You're going to trade. We need you to buy what we've got, and we need to get some stuff from you too. So we've got economic trade network throughout the entire world, but not necessarily by choice for some. Then there was also an intellectual revolution as well. Behind the New Order stood an even deeper intellectual revolution, one that began with the Renaissance, but came to fruition in the 19th and 20th centuries. Western civilization turned to observation and experimentation as the primary means of gaining knowledge, and then began applying that knowledge to the transformation of the world. So Western civilization is shifting now to the scientific method type of way of looking at things. You observe what's going on, you run experiments to try to find out what is actually happening in the natural world, and then you gain knowledge as a result of that, and you can use that knowledge to do some incredible things, and we know that, and that's going to lead to the world not being the same place that it was in the past. It's going to change. The first major application of this knowledge was related to the Industrial Revolution and the energy it required. So we know this to be the fact. You're going to need some things in order for this Industrial Revolution to keep right on rolling. You're going to need, obviously, the ability to manufacture goods in the cheapest way possible and the most efficient way. So that's going to lead to some things. You're going to need a way to transport goods and get them there to places more quickly than you may have done in the past. So it's going to kind of be that saying, necessity is the mother of invention. There's going to be some necessary things, and there are going to be some inventions that come that are going to fulfill the needs that are going to be seen. For centuries, the main sources of energy had been water and wind. Now new forms of energy were developed. The modern piston engine, first developed in the late 16th century, so this actually had been around for a while at this point. It had been the late 16th, early 17th centuries. Well, it's going to be applied now both to industrial production and to transportation, two big issues. So again, the two things that I said, you're going to need to be able to produce things in the most efficient way possible, as quickly as possible. And it even helps to maybe not have to have as many people to help with it, and you can use machines instead. And then you're going to have a way to transport that stuff. So the modern piston engine is going to be a big part of that. Journeys that had previously taken months now took only weeks or 7 days. That's a big change. You go from, I'm going to go on a trip. Well, how long is it going to take you? It's going to take you months. We don't really have an understanding of that. Now, you may go on a vacation and be gone for a month or more, but you didn't take that time just traveling. You took that time the travel was relatively short, especially compared to this. You took that time to actually go and spend time somewhere else. Well, at this time, if you're going to take a long trip, or before this time, you're looking at months. Now it may be weeks or even just days. So that's a huge change. Then came the internal combustion engine and its application to transportation, which led to the automobile and the trucking industry, to the building of wider roads, to new patterns of family life, to the colonization of the oil-rich lands of the Middle East, and to myriad changes in the entire process of industrial production and marketing. So obviously don't need to emphasize how big of a game changer it was for the internal combustion engine to be developed, and then the uses for it. Obviously, as you see in this list, it changed just about everything. And it's certainly a new world now everywhere. The internal combustion engine applied to aviation made the world even smaller than the steam engine and the railroad had. So you got the railroad, that lets you travel faster. You've got a steam engine, even on the water you can travel faster. You've got a car you can get in and drive and go places, but now you can get there by air, and that's a whole new ball game. Again, you look at the time frames, it went from months to weeks to days. Now with the aviation industry developing, you're just a matter of hours from getting anywhere. And that changes the whole world. By the second half of the 20th century, it was apparent that new forms of and sources of energy had to be found and developed. And obviously that has changed things as well. If you go from a world that's mostly getting by on water and wind, there's not a whole lot of work that needs to be done. I mean, you have to harness those things, build a windmill, go down to the mill and put a water wheel in the water and let that generate energy. But then that's it. You don't have to go looking for more sources of it. You know where it's going to be. The wind blows. There may be certain places it's better to get it, but the wind's going to blow when it blows. Same thing with the water. The water's going to flow, and as long as you're on the path of the flow of the water, you're going to have energy, but it's not going to be nearly enough. And it's too bound to one spot. So you're going to need new sources in order to power all of this. And that's going to lead into the energy revolution that's coming, and then what becomes problems as a result of that. Soon, nuclear power appeared on the scene, leading to debates between those who extolled its efficiency and those who feared its dangers. So the development of nuclear power and also other ways of using the nuclear capabilities we'll look at, that's going to be a big game changer as well. And it's all coming out of this industrial revolution, which leads to an intellectual revolution because of the necessity of the development of technology, both to produce the things that the industrial revolution is going to produce, but also to be able to transport them and it certainly is a game changer. As we keep looking at the changes that come at this time, there's going to be changes in the way communication is going to happen as well. It's going to have a lot of effect on this time period. The world also shrank due to new methods of communication. Samuel Morse invented the electric telegraph in 1837, and by 1844 it became a viable mode of communication. The first telephone was demonstrated in 1877. So big changes, big advances in communication. Obviously, if you wanted to communicate with somebody that was not in your area, it's going to take a lot of time and effort to make that happen. Now it can be done with far less effort and much more quickly. By the 1950s, television had become a common household feature in most of the industrialized world. What a big change that made in communicating messages and even in entertainment as well, but to be able to get that out to people in a way that is now happening constantly, it made a huge change in the world. In 1975, the use of computers was limited to a relatively small number of people working mostly on technical matters. By 2010, preschool children were using computers. People were able to get in touch with virtually anyone, anywhere in the world instantly, and the internet contained more information than any library could ever hold. If you lived through the time period pre-internet to post-internet, and pre-computers being available for everyone to post-computers being available to everyone, you understand how big of a change this is. And it's amazing that in such a very short amount of time, the world has changed this much as a result of these technologies, but it certainly has. These developments were the culmination of efforts began in the 19th century and even earlier. Throughout the 19th century, Western civilization had considered itself destined to lead the world into an age of happiness and abundance. And that period of time kind of lasted until World War I. So there was a real thought that good times were going to last and only good things were coming for the world. And then all of a sudden that's going to crash and burn, as we'll see. In Asia, Africa, and Latin America, the native population appeared eager to absorb the ways and wisdom of industrial Europe and the United States. These are areas that we can largely look at now as being resistant to this, but it didn't start out that way. That's going to be the result of some things that are going to come where these areas are going to be turned off from Western ideas and thinking because of the way it all went down. But at first, they're looking at, hey, we need to get in on this as well. So it's not really the way we look at it now, but it was the way it started. The cause of missions prospered in spite of such setbacks as the Boxer Rebellion in China, and there were hopes that in the very near future, most of the world's population would be Christian. So again, as communication advances, as there are advances in technology and the willingness of people around the world to embrace it, there's going to be this hope that Christianity will spread, and it certainly does, and that the world's population would be Christian. And that didn't happen, but it certainly did happen that a whole lot more of them became Christians. So the church is going to benefit from all of this stuff as well, but it's also going to cause problems for the churches with most anything. For almost a century, with minor exceptions, the European powers had lived in peace with each other. That's a big deal too. You think back on our study, for a long time, all they did was fight. After the fall of the Roman Empire to the development of the new areas that became the nations that would then be swept up into nationalism and eventually went to war or were attacked by others. That happened for a long time. It was very disruptive. It was a big problem for the church because, unfortunately, religion got involved in all of it, some by choice, some by force. But now we're at a period of time in which, for almost 100 years, a century, with very minor exceptions, Europe was at peace. And that's another reason for all the optimism at the time. But then, of course, we know what's coming. That's not going to last at all. All right, we're going to stop there because what's coming next is going to be a lot of stuff that has to do with World War I, World War II, and the development of events in the Western world and how that affects the rest of the world. And then ultimately what that means for the church throughout this time period. So this was really long, and I didn't want to have to break it up, but I think it's just going to have to be. It's too long not to. So we're going to stop there. Next week, we'll jump straight into those big historical events that take place during this time period, and then move us forward again in very broad brush strokes, what that's going to mean for Christianity, and what we can look forward to as we finish out this study for the development of the church, both in the Western world, but also in the rest of the world. So we'll finish that out next week. And in the meantime, hope you have a great rest of your week. Thanks for taking time with me today, and God bless.